Hello and welcome to the 13th, and as it turns out, the final episode of the 3 on NY3 podcast. My name is Andrew Whitman. Want to begin with a bit of an apology to you, the audience. I probably could have recorded this episode 3 or 4 weeks ago. I have been working to try to find a path forward for the podcast to continue, but it turns out that was not to be. This is actually the 8th or 9th attempt that I've made to try and record this episode. I've been unsure exactly what to say or how much to opine, given that this may well be my last time in front of a public-facing microphone, at least for a little while. Part of me wanted to give commentary on the candidates or the state of the race in NY3. Part of me wanted to talk about national issues that are of import and that have bothered me, or at least had me thinking quite a bit over the last several weeks. Part of me wanted to give commentary about the value of opinion, or the glut of opinion, or the state of the news media in this current moment. None of that, however, felt particularly appropriate. Maybe I just didn't want the podcast to end and was somewhat wrestling with my own internal mechanisms and psyche during this process. In reality, there were 2 factors that led to the end of the podcast. The first being the changing geography of the 3rd District. When this podcast and the race in New York's 3rd District began this year, the district was spread across 5 counties. It is now down to 2. The original district was an unusual one that I felt might suffer from incomplete media coverage. After all, the district included Suffolk, Nassau, Queens, Bronx, and Westchester counties, and that would sort of be split up among Nassau and Long Island-based media, New York City-based media, and Westchester-based media. Given the restrictions or limitations of the new drawing of the 3rd District, I think voters and candidates will be better able to be served by Long Island-based media than somewhat undermining or at least eroding some of the rationale for this podcast. The candidates also, I believe, viewed me as both Westchester-based and likely with a more progressive audience. Both are possible and realistic conclusions stemming from my work with RNN, as well as my involvement with the candidate forum in March that was hosted in part by Indivisible and other progressive groups. I also tried to ask questions of the candidates that were not limited to ideological orientation within the Democratic Party. My aim and my hopes that my actions in practice led to progressives having to defend their progressive positions and electability, and I asked the moderates to do the same. I mention this because it speaks to the other reason this podcast is coming to somewhat of a premature close, something of a lack of access to the candidates. When the race began, the field had 6 candidates. Alessandra Biaggi left the race to challenge Sean Patrick Maloney in New York's 17th district after the lines were redrawn by the monitor, the court-appointed monitor, so we were down to 5 candidates. Of those 5 candidates, we got commitments from 2 to continue. We got a soft commitment from a 3rd candidate to continue their participation in the podcast. But 2 of the campaigns indicated they did not want to continue to engage with the podcast, and there just wasn't any reason or ability to continue with just 3 candidates. The plan was to shift from interviews that we did with all 6 candidates to one-on-one debates. The problem is when you're down to 3 candidates who are participating, that leads you to a total of 3 debates, which is far too limited and does not do what I hope the podcast would do. I do want to point out that, at least in my opinion, some candidates enjoyed the back and forth of this podcast and their dialogue with me more than others. All of the candidates who offered to continue had, at least in my view, and I assume in theirs, positive appearances on the podcast. They felt the experience left them looking and feeling good. The 2 candidates who declined to continue with the podcast, I believe, had a different view, but I will not deign to speak for them. So, with that, the podcast is coming to a close. What's next for me? I don't know. I'm unsure. I find myself at a crossroads, really unable to decide what direction to travel next. I have been for the past 15 years a political journalist, but I'm honestly not sure that can continue. Had the podcast lived on through the general election, my job as its host would have included attempts to interview the Republican nominee, and given the state of national politics, January 6th in the effort to overturn the 2020 election, not to mention court rulings recently on guns and abortion, I don't know if I could have been objective in speaking with Republican candidates. And that makes me uneasy, I should say, about continuing in political journalism. I'm also not sure about the value of pursuing some sort of opinion-based career path. Clearly, I have opinions and an interest in sharing them publicly. While I tried to remove my own views from the Q&A in this podcast, I have slowly begun sharing some opinions again on Twitter, really doing so for the first time since leaving RNN 12 months ago. But there is a glut of political opinion to be had these days, not to mention an overload of podcasts. And I really do fear that any contributions that I would make in that regard might just be a thimbleful in an ocean full of opinion. So in many ways, I find myself now back where I was before the podcast began, unemployed, unsure of what direction to take next, yet still interested and concerned about the state of our politics and our national political dialogue. I'm curious what thoughts you, the audience of this podcast, might have, what you think I might be a good use of my time and energies. What would you recommend as my next project? But with that is it for me and for the 3 on NY3 podcast. Before I go, I want to thank the candidates and their staffs who made this podcast possible, the people who have offered me encouragement that there was value in this project, and of course to you, the audience, both here and throughout my quarter century in broadcasting and my 20 years in front of the camera. Each episode of 3 on NY3 will remain accessible, at least throughout the election, and perhaps in perpetuity, so that voters in the 3rd District and, well, one of the candidates is now in the 17th, so those in the 17th District can still hear the conversations that I had with their candidates. I'm open to whatever input you might want to offer. You can still reach out to me at 3onny3@gmail.com or at andrewwhitmantv@gmail.com. A reminder that congressional primary day in New York is August 23rd and that general election day is November 8th. This has been 3 on NY3, and my name is Andrew Whitman. I will see you hopefully somewhere down the road. Thank you so much, and goodbye.